ASIC has been sentenced to death. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. John, it's a big day.
Hello, Martin. It is a big day. It is 2 years in the making. Earlier this afternoon, the Senate Economic References Committee handed down its report into ASIC, as we foreshadowed in our last show. And just like we said in our last episode, it's a landmark report. It is a once-in-a-generation change that Senator Bragg has put forward to the Parliament and obviously to the Senate. And we're going to go into the detail very soon. But Martin, this is so big in terms of the significance of this report and the work you and I have done with many people across the country that every leading business story tonight is the report about ASIC and the dramatic news that has come from the Australian Senate.
Absolutely. Long time coming, long time needed. This is a really, really important change. If, and I say a big if this does lead to change. Remember that this is not the first Senate inquiry into ASIC. There are at least a couple of others, which really, frankly, did hardly anything at the end of the day. But kudos to Bragg and his team. The report is pretty dramatic. It's pretty no holds barred. And also there isn't really a sector of the Senate who is actually opposing it. You know, a couple of minor tweaks and what have you, but this is really quite remarkable.
Well, look, in terms of whether people will support or oppose, we'll get to that in a second, because in the last hour, there's been some dramatic news, and we're recording on Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Sydney time. So it's obviously your morning in the UK. So things are evolving as we speak, Martin. But Martin, the reason why this is so historic, and we tried to allude to this in the last episode, the report says that ASIC is broken. It cannot be fixed. If it can't be fixed, it must be abolished, and it must be replaced with something. And the big regulatory architecture question that people didn't know where Senator Bragg was going to go was he has recommended two new agencies, one that focuses on regulating corporations and another agency that regulates the financial system. So now this is not a thought bubble by Senator Bragg. This comes from the academic work of Associate Professor Andy Schmuller from the University of Wollongong, who gave dramatic testimony last November when he was banging the desk about ASIC and their political manipulation around Dorothy Dix's, etc. One of the best academics in the country who has been working on this issue of financial system regulation for 10 years and is a world-leading expert, basically presented his academic work to the inquiry and basically said that there are many structures around the world, and the best structure is to have a corporate cop and a financial services cop, and that's exactly what Bragg has recommended. And so not only is this a once-in-a-generation report, because we've had for 35 years one model, and now Bragg's saying that model is broken and we need to move past that. He has taken the best world-leading approach based on the work of one of Australia's top academics and says we're going to have the best structure, the best system that Australia can have. And that's why it's dramatic reform, it's landmark reform, and in my view, given the totality of the evidence. So yes, there has been attempts to fix ASIC in the last 3 decades, but as we go forward, ASIC continues to decline in performance. It's declining in outcomes. There are more victims. More people are upset with how the financial system has evolved in this country, and people want change. And change is what Senator Bragg delivered in this report.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to just highlight the Wollongong connection. What is it about the water in Wollongong, if you think about it?
Well, I continue to tell people who I talk to around the country, Wollongong is the heart of the revolution. So it's whether it's me or when you were in the Illawarra or Professor Shmulo who teaches at the University of Wollongong. We don't sort of take too kindly to the arrogance of the capital cities. So when I saw the arrogance of ASIC 2 years ago, I thought to myself, I have to do something about this, and so here we are. So it's a process that what I'll say, Martin, is that about 8 weeks after I handed in my package or the report of alleged misconduct back in April of 2022, I was expecting a certain type of reception from ASIC. You know, after you spend 10 months researching something and you give it to law enforcement, you'd expect to be called in and asked questions and the opportunity to explain what your set of allegations are. And ASIC just didn't want to talk to me. And I said to myself, well, how can this be a genuine investigation? How can this be genuine law enforcement if there's no curiosity by the ASIC investigators? So I thought to myself, no, something is fundamentally wrong. And obviously with the history of ASIC over a long period of time, I thought to myself, I want to do something about ASIC. And that's when I started to put together the basis of the research report and went to Parliament in August 2022 and found universal concern in the Australian Senate about ASIC. And having done politics for 20 years, I've never seen an issue where every single senator that I ran into was concerned about ASIC and its performance. And it was just a once in a lifetime political opportunity, because usually when you go into Parliament, you'll see very big disagreements on all sorts of issues. But on this one issue, everyone was of the same mind, and it's not delivering for the Australian people, and people want change. And I thought to myself, well, there's no better chance to get an inquiry up than this opportunity. So, you know, we went to work on the report and we got the national coverage, and Senator Bragg came to the table 3.5 weeks later with the inquiry, and here we are. And, you know, the reality is, Martin, is that had ASIC picked up the phone and called me 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't be at this point where now the Parliament, or at least Senator Bragg and the Senate Economic References Committee, is recommending that ASIC be abolished.
Absolutely. And if you look back over the history, you know, your little muddy footprints are all over this from the beginning. One observation about the report, which I think is a really, really good report because it goes into a lot of detail, particularly around the obfuscation that ASIC tried to run in the early days in particular, you know, trying to basically intervene and to try and, you know, get the inquiry steered off in a different direction, et cetera, et cetera. The other interesting observation, though, there's very little in this about the recognition that I think we need to also come to, and that is that part of ASIC's problem is that there are too much on the side of the corporates, and that their natural mindset is to play for the corporates rather than being effectively the cop on the beat. And so that's partly a cultural thing, but I also think it's a very important detailed observation. So it'll be really interested to see whether they can move the tiller to be able to get corporates to be frightened of ASIC, because I don't think they are at the moment.
Well, I mean, the one point I'll say about that, Martin, is that you've had people at the top of ASIC who have been there for 10, 15, 20 years. And those people are the people who are captured. So the Warren Days, who's now left, the Greg Yankos, the Chris Savandras, the Tim Mullally's, the Louise Macaulay, and Louise Macaulay has just recently left as well. So the old guard are the ones who had the softly approach with the corporates. And even if you don't change a thing other than change the leadership team, you could have a dramatic different posture in terms of their level of aggressiveness to pursue corporate misconduct right across the board, not just in terms of the small end of the town, but also in terms of the big end of town. So there's so much to say about culture. And Martin, that's a nice segue, because I just did want to touch on what happened on Monday. So we're recording on Wednesday. But on Monday, as I said in our last show, that I was going to go to Parliament. So I did go to Parliament, and I had the opportunity to talk to a number of the key players. So I spoke to Stephen Jones's advisor. Stephen Jones is the Minister for Financial Services. I spoke to Peter Dutton's chief economist. I spoke to the Shadow Minister for Financial Services and his team, spoke to the Greens, and then obviously speak to a number of journalists as well up in the press gallery. And what I found was there is universal agreement in Parliament, including with Labor, that reform must happen. So walking into today, I knew, having spoken to all the key players on Monday, no one wants the status quo. The public don't want the status quo, neither do the parliamentarians. The question was always going to be, well, what would reform look like? And on Monday, no one really knew what Senator Bragg was going to propose, and that was obviously going to be in terms of the big mystery. But as I walked around, I actually had the printout of those staff survey results. And when I started showing people what ASIC staff thought of their own organization, and I showed them that 2% figure that we covered in the last program, it really hit home for a lot, because these statistics weren't particularly well known among the key players in Parliament. But once I put that graph in front of the key people, the advisors, politicians, etc., and they could see that ASIC's own people have such low opinion of their own organization, their own leadership team, it really scored the importance of not just small reform or piecemeal reform, but in terms of major reform. The interesting thing about Parliament, Martin, is sometimes people expect that the key players are across all the information. And because Parliament is so busy with so many competing issues flying through the building day in, day out, sometimes it's just a matter of making sure that you've gone and spoke to the key people and make sure that they're aware of the key points. And these staff survey results, which is something that Senator Bragg mentioned in his speech in the Senate today, they are just so explosive because, again, like I said in our last show, in 123 years of the federal government, you have never seen results that bad. And that just underscores why ASIC has no credibility. And Martin, you talk about the obfuscation, the manipulation of the vote back in 2022 in terms of the establishment of the inquiry. Some of the biggest stories we did last year around the Dorothy Dixer story and political collusion, or Joseph Longo ordering his government relations team to manipulate the Bragg motion, and that show for us was the ASIC ordering the manipulation of Australian democracy. All of that really nasty, if not corrupt behavior that we saw and we exposed on this channel was mentioned today in Senator Bragg's speech, mentioned also in the report. And ASIC thought they could sort of get through this inquiry process with their usual tactics that they have been able to use for the last 15 years and basically bypass Parliament. But credit to Senator Bragg, he wasn't going to let that happen. And to the extent that you and I could expose their tricks and their their underhand ways via YouTube, I was prepared to push the envelope. And so here we are in 2024. ASIC has been recommended to be abolished, and we'll obviously have to see what the next step is after this.
Yeah, and you mentioned Bragg's speech. We're going to play that now because I thought it was a brilliant speech, not least because it does actually manage to contextualize so much in quite a short period of time, but also effectively sets up the case for action, the case for change. So let's play that now.
Bragg.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. I rise to make some remarks in relation to the Senate Economics References Committee's inquiry into the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. This is a committee of inquiry which has run for almost 20 months. The reason this committee inquiry was established was to get to the bottom of why ASIC had not been a successful corporate regulator. I was very concerned that people in Australia were not getting the services of the corporate cop as they should, that too many corporate crimes were going unpunished. Now, in establishing this inquiry, there was a significant amount of interference from the agency itself, which had sought to influence the vote the Senate took to establish this inquiry, which was quite improper. But nonetheless, the Senate decided to establish this inquiry, and I thank the crossbench for their support in establishing this important inquiry, which I think anyone who has a reasonable view on things would say has unearthed a lot of very good evidence which the committee secretariat has put together. Now, we tried to look at the way in which ASIC goes about its business through looking at cases, looking at the culture of the organisation and looking at the structure. The government and ASIC filed a lot of public interest immunity claims which hampered the Senate's ability to do its work. I would say that ASIC went out of its way to obstruct the inquiry, and there was no reason for ASIC not to provide redacted case files so we could see their investigative methods. Professor Alan Fells, who gave evidence to our committee, made the point that there's nothing secret about the investigative methods that ASIC is doing. And he made the point that if ASIC was a particularly good regulator, maybe there was something secret, but there was nothing secret to be hidden. I think ASIC, in the main, just wanted to obstruct the Senate's work. Now, ASIC really has one job, and that job is to be a law enforcement agency. We come to Canberra, we pass laws, corporate laws, financial services laws and the like, and we expect that the regulator will try and enforce those laws by pursuing civil and criminal cases, building a brief of evidence and winning a conviction in the court. Now, sadly, that is not the case in Australia, and that is why I believe that Australia has become, in many respects, a haven for white-collar crime. Now, there are so many cases that could have been catalogued in our committee report, but we decided to look at a few cases: Dixon Advisory, Newix, Calkine, Courtney House. In all these cases, ASIC was given multiple opportunities to enforce the law quickly. Now, as we've seen in the US, with the US agencies moving very quickly on the FTX collapse, where they were able to build a brief of evidence and then put someone away for many years, ASIC seems to take months and months and sometimes years to respond to complaints. Now, often the complaints have been made by insiders, whistleblowers. I mean, whistleblowers are treated appallingly in this country, appallingly. And so many opportunities slipped out of the hands of ASIC to stop what was a very bad situation with Dixon, Courtney House, Newix and Calkine. Calkine actually is still happening as we speak. And so the real impact in the community is that fair-minded people who think they're living in a country where financial services laws, consumer protection laws are enforced are frankly getting destroyed financially in many cases because of the inaction and the slow pace. So when it comes down to it, the investigation that we undertook looked at the culture, the leadership and the structure. In terms of culture, we were able to discover through our inquiries the staff survey of ASIC, and it found that staff motivation was at 20%. Staff satisfaction was below 20%. It's a very sick agency. We also, unfortunately, had to spend a lot of time on looking at the massive dysfunction at the commission level, where commissioners were at war with one another, leaking to the media, engaging in all sorts of unsavoury business and activity. And unfortunately, there were also secret investigations into commissioners which weren't made known to the public, which were covered up by ASIC. And I think the culture of the organisation from top to bottom is extremely sick. In terms of the structure, and I don't want to be too unfair on ASIC, the structure it's been given by this parliament is one that it cannot be successful in. Since the Wallace inquiry of the mid-90s, ASIC has been given more and more things. We started out with 2 peaks in the Twin Peaks model, APRA, which was given prudential supervision from the Reserve Bank, and then ASIC, supposed to be focused on consumer protection. But every time there's been a problem in Canberra since 1997, it's been given to ASIC, and ASIC is now a monolith. It is so big, and it can't possibly be successful as a sprawling financial services regulator and as a companies regulator. And it does the registration of businesses, it looks after market integrity, derivatives, insurance, liquidators, investment banks, private equity, takeovers. It is far too big, which is why we have recommended a new structure for corporate law enforcement in Australia, which would be a splitting of ASIC up and a creation of two new bodies. One, a companies regulator, and two, a financial services enforcement agency. So two separate bodies, one focus on companies and the enforcement of the corporate law, and one focus on financial services regulation. We think that is a very important structural change. Secondly, there needs to be much more transparency around how complaints are handled. And where there are convictions recorded against people or against organisations, criminal and civil penalties, there should be a searchable register. People should be able to see what has actually happened in the past. And I believe that in relation to whistleblowers, we should be rewarding whistleblowers who take risks, often with their own lives, to call out appalling conduct in corporate and financial services in Australia. And so we've made strong recommendations in relation to whistleblower protection, but also in relation to whistleblower rewards. In terms of the structure of the new agencies, if they are adopted by this parliament, I think the idea of a commission structure is dead. There is too many opportunities for buck passing, and I think that in future there should be a statutory appointment of a CEO of each of these new agencies, which can be held to account more easily by Parliament and stakeholders. I also think that in relation to the funding for these new bodies, we ought to find a way to lighten the load on small business. Small businesses, particularly in the financial sector, are paying enormous levies to ASIC, and I think that there is a better way that we can do that. Now, I want to just make two final points before I sit down, and that is that this is the third such inquiry in the last few decades into ASIC by the Senate. There was one in the early 90s, which was done by Chris Ellison, and there was another one done by the Labor Senator Mark Bishop about 10 years ago. And they both made what I would say were deck chair on the Titanic style recommendations. We have gone for a complete change here into new agencies and the end of ASIC, because I don't think it can be fixed culturally or structurally, and so that's why we've made this perhaps controversial recommendation, but I think it's the only way you can fix the situation. This has been a process which has asked a lot from a lot of people who didn't have to engage with the parliamentary process, but they have, often for no personal benefit other than to make sure that we could catalogue the evidence. And the evidence is that when ASIC receives complaints and warnings, it doesn't act. And so I want to thank all the people who've bravely come forward, whistleblowers, insiders, people who've been wronged. I want to thank them very much. That your voice has been heard, and your voice has now been put into what I believe are very strong recommendations, which have been adopted, I would say, in large part by the government and by the Greens, because there are no dissenting reports. This is a report of the Senate with some qualifications from government senators, but largely speaking, I believe we have done a job here which the public expect, which we've tried to work together to find common ground. So I want to thank the Secretariat very much for the huge body of work that they've done here. Such fantastic public servants who make us look really good. But I wanted to just close in thanking all the people that came forward to put on record their very concerning evidence.
So, John, there you have it. Bragg very much on form.
The question comes now, Martin, is so what happens from here on in? So from this point, the government has 90 days to respond to the Bragg Report. When I've looked at in the last hour at the Australian newspaper, there apparently Labor is pushing back on the idea of splitting ASIC up. Yet the problem for Labor is twofold. One is the current version of ASIC is not supported not just by the Senator Bragg and the coalition, but there are other political parties in the Senate, whether it's the Greens or One Nation or others, who don't support the current formulation of ASIC. So just like 2 years ago when Labor voted against the Bragg motion for the inquiry and everyone else voted with Bragg, Labor is sort of on their own in terms of wanting to keep the current version of ASIC intact. But on the other hand, Labor has no plan to improve ASIC's performance. So ASIC ASIC's performance has been declining, and it's rock bottom now. So what is Labor's plan to fix it? Labor has no plan. And so I think it's politically dangerous for Labor to be in a position where you have the coalition wanting to be tough on corporate crime going into the next election, and Labor looking very weak and trying to protect a failing institution. So, the politics of this is going to be very interesting, but let's see what happens in the next 90 days in terms of what Labor's position is in terms of ASIC reform. But there's still quite a bit of information for us to communicate about ASIC, about this report, but also in terms of the package, in terms of the show we did last year, Martin, which was The Final Secret, exposing the Australian Prime Minister, and things happening in terms of how the investigation into the package was done, the Prime Minister's involvement. What conclusion did ASIC reach in the package investigation? I came together with Robbie Barwick and Florian Heisey and a whole bunch of Australians back in 2019, 2020, over a 16-month period to stop the Morrison government putting people in jail for using physical cash. That was a historic achievement as the first YouTube campaign in Australian history to stop Parliament passing a law. So in 2022, we came together to start the process to educate the public on financial crime. We triggered a Senate inquiry, and 2 years later, the Senate is now saying, let's abolish ASIC and let's try to fix a problem that has been plaguing the Australian people for at least 15 years. And today's historic outcome would not have been possible without this channel, Martin, without your support, and without the support of the audience. So thank you to everyone. It's a great day, and hopefully we can build a better country.
Absolutely, John. It is about the interests of the people, absolutely. And I would also make the point that we are not monetizing this show. So those who've been accusing us of doing clickbait and those sorts of things are way off the point. We do this because we think that this is really, really important for the prosperity of Australians and for the future prosperity of the country. And when corporate cops are not doing what they should be doing, corporates get away with a whole load of stuff. And we've now seen that with the right levers, and social media is part of that, and with the right political support, we can wrought change. And it's also true, John, isn't it, that we will make sure that these recommendations don't just get sort of parked somewhere, but it is actually going to lead to transformational change in the interests of the people.
That I agree with you, Martin. So we're gonna commit to ensuring that these recommendations do come into effect in one form or another. But Martin, can I just say, perhaps 2 years ago, ASIC thought that this show was clickbait. But when I remember a conversation you and I had at the beginning of 2022, and we talked about we just didn't want to be commentators anymore. We actually wanted to use this channel to galvanize the Australian people to actually move the needle, to actually get real change. And so when you have a report in the Australian Senate calling for ASIC to be abolished, that's actually a real outcome. That's not clickbait. So we may have an interesting style of how we communicate information, but let the audience be assured when we say we're going to do something, a shot, and we have a track record of results. So whatever the next target is, Martin, and who knows what that next target post ASIC is, whoever that target is, they better just watch out because we're coming.
Yeah, we're serious about what we do, and people should understand that this is a serious, passionate quest from both you and I to make things better. Martin North, John Adams in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.